Seoul. 11:47 p.m. rain needled the windows of Kang Tower, headquarters of one of Korea's largest shipping and logistics conglomerates. On the 41st floor, long after every executive office had gone dark, a lone cleaning cart squeaked down the hallway. Amara Eze pushed it past door after door, exhausted, counting the minutes until her shift ended. She reached the heavy steel door at the end of the corridor, the executive archive, the one room she'd been told, twice, never to enter. Tonight, it was open, just a crack, and smoke was leaking out from underneath it. She pressed her ear to the gap first, the old instinct of someone who'd learned the hard way that curiosity without caution gets people hurt. She should have called security first. Instead, she pushed the door wider, and found two men in black, kneeling over an open filing cabinet, soaking 40-year-old folders in something that smelled like gasoline. One of them turned. "Get her!" Amara didn't scream. She grabbed the fire extinguisher mounted on the wall and swung it into the nearest man's chest hard enough to send him stumbling into a shelf of files. The second lunged for her, and that's when she heard it. A struggle down the hall near the elevators. A man's voice, low and furious, fighting for his life against someone twice his size. She didn't know yet that the man by the elevators was Kang Min-jun, heir to the company whose logo was stitched on her uniform. All she knew was that someone needed help, and the extinguisher in her hands still had half a canister left. She ran toward the struggle, pulled the pin, and emptied it into the attacker's face. He staggered back, blind and coughing. Long enough for the man he'd been choking to wrench free. "This way, go!" Amara hauled the stunned, bleeding stranger toward the stairwell as the fire alarm finally tore through the building. Behind them, flames had already caught the curtains near the archive door. She should have kept running. Instead, on an instinct she couldn't explain even to herself later, she doubled back into the smoke, grabbed the one folder that had spilled loose onto the floor, and bolted out seconds before the sprinklers engaged. By the time security swarmed the floor, the intruders were gone, scaling the fence at the edge of the parking structure roof. One of them paused just long enough for a security camera to catch a glint of silver at his wrist. A watch engraved with the Kang Group crest, the kind issued only to senior directors. Whoever had ordered this hadn't hired strangers off the street. He worked 2 floors above the chairman's office. The official report the next morning would call it a wiring malfunction. Only 3 people in the building knew otherwise. A frightened cleaner with a soaked, half-burned folder hidden in her locker, the bruised air she'd pulled from the stairwell, and somewhere in that building, the man who had given the order that it would not be the last time Amara saved his life that year. It would not even be the most dangerous. Amara Eze had not come to Seoul to push a cleaning cart. 3 years earlier she'd arrived on a business scholarship, sharp enough to skip a year of university back in Lagos, determined to build something her father would have been proud of. Then her father died, the scholarship money dried up, and her mother Ngozi's heart condition meant Amara brought her to Seoul for treatment instead of going home. Now she worked nights cleaning offices and mornings pulling espresso shots, and what was left of her business degree lived in a drawer she hadn't opened in a year. She told no one at the company who she'd pulled out of that stairwell. She didn't have to. By 9 the next morning, Kang Min-jun had pulled the security badge logs himself. He found her on her lunch break, still in her cafe apron, and for a long moment he just looked at her. The woman who'd put out a fire with her bare nerve and dragged him to safety without once asking who he was. "You could have just run," he said. "I almost did." She studied his bandaged hand. Congratulations in order, or condolences? I don't know what you do here." A flicker of something. Surprise, maybe the first real laugh he'd had in months, crossed his face. "I'm Kang Min-jun." She blinked. The Kang Min-jun, the one whose name was on the building. He tried to give her money. She refused it, which seemed to unsettle him more than the fire had. What she asked for instead was simpler. Better hours, so she could be at the hospital when her mother's doctor made his evening rounds. He didn't just grant it. Against every instinct of a company built on hierarchy, he had her reassigned by the end of the week as his personal assistant. Officially for security continuity after the break-in, unofficially because he could not stop thinking about a woman who'd looked at danger and chosen to run toward it. Min-jun had grown up surrounded by people who wanted something from him. A deal, a favor, a seat at a table he hadn't asked to inherit. He couldn't remember the last time someone had simply pulled him out of danger and expected nothing back for it. It unsettled him more than he let on, and it was the real reason he kept finding excuses to walk past her desk twice a day instead of once. The second attempt came 4 days later, and it nearly worked. Min-jun and Amara were crossing a side street outside a supplier's warehouse when a black sedan jumped the curb without warning, engine roaring, aimed straight for them. Amara didn't think. She grabbed the back of his jacket and threw them both sideways into a stack of shipping pallets a half second before the car would have caught them. The sedan clipped a parked motorcycle, sent it spinning across the asphalt, and was gone before a single warehouse worker had even looked up. Min-jun sat in the dust, staring at the fresh black skid marks. That wasn't an accident. No, Amara said, her hands still shaking. It wasn't. He didn't report it to the board. He reported it quietly to a private security firm and started carrying a second phone no one else knew the number to. His father's board was furious about the assistant appointment regardless. A foreign night shift cleaner, in the executive suite, beside the heir. Min-jun didn't care. What he didn't tell anyone, what he barely admitted to himself, was that for the first time since his grandfather died, someone in that building had looked at him like a person and not a balance sheet. 3 floors below. In an office with a view, he felt he deserved more than his cousin currently occupying the chairman's seat. Director Kang Dae-young reviewed the security report from the fire. His jaw tightened at one line. Item retrieved by unidentified staff member. Contents unknown. He picked up his phone. Find out exactly what was in that drawer, he said quietly. And find out exactly who has it. What drove Dae-young wasn't simple greed. Not entirely. His own father had built half a career on the very fraud buried in that file. A board seat, family standing, an inheritance passed down as though it had been earned outright. If the truth surfaced now, it wouldn't just cost the company a settlement. It would erase the only version of his family's history he had ever been allowed to believe. 2 nights later, in an underground garage 3 districts away, Dae-young handed a manila envelope of cash to a quiet, broad-shouldered man named Choi, the kind of man who never asked unnecessary questions. The girl from the cleaning crew, Dae-young said. Find out what she knows. Make sure she keeps it to herself. Choi didn't nod. He didn't need to. Weeks passed, and the office learned to stop whispering, mostly. Amara turned out to have an instinct for the business no one had bothered to ask about. She caught a costing error in a freight contract that saved the company a quiet fortune, and Min-jun started bringing her into meetings he once would have sat through alone. Late one night, working past midnight on a shipment crisis, she made him try jollof rice from a container she'd packed for dinner. He made a face at the heat, then asked for seconds, and for the first time in the relationship neither of them could name yet, they laughed about something that had nothing to do with the company. It was good. It was, for a few weeks, almost easy. One night after the office had emptied out, Min-jun found her on the building's roof garden. The city spread out gold and restless below them. My father used to bring me up here when I was small, he said, before he learned to talk to me the way he talks to shareholders. Amara told him, in turn, about her own father's habit of pointing at any tall building in Lagos and promising her, half joking, that she'd own one of her own someday. He never got the chance to be right about that, she said. Maybe I'll borrow yours instead. Neither of them said anything else for a while. Standing that close to him, looking out at a city neither of them had been born to inherit. She didn't feel like she had to. They didn't have to. Then his father called a family dinner, the kind with place cards. Min-jun was told, not asked, that he would marry Yoon Seo-yun, daughter of a shipping ally, within the year. The merger would stabilize the stock price. Dae-young had spent months quietly destabilizing behind the scenes, and a wedding, the chairman said, was simply good business. Amara heard about it the way most of the office did. A press release, before Min-jun had the chance to tell her himself. She said nothing. She typed his correspondence the next morning with perfect composure and went home and cried where no one could see her. Seo-yun herself sought her out 2 days later, finding Amara alone in the break room with a quiet, almost apologetic directness. You're the one who pulled him out of the fire, she said. Not a question. For what it's worth, I didn't ask for this engagement either. My father wants the merger. I want to finish my degree in Geneva and never think about shipping contracts again. She studied Amara a moment longer than politeness required. I just thought you should hear that from me, and not a press release. The pressure on Amara didn't stay confined to subway platforms and family dinners. Within the week, the hospital's billing office called to say her mother's payment plan had been abruptly restructured. The full balance now due within 30 days. No explanation offered beyond an internal policy review. Amara recognized Dae-young's signature on cruelty, even when his name wasn't on the form. She paid what she could, smiled at the cashier, and didn't let herself cry again until she was back outside in the cold. The folder, still damp at the edges, sat untouched in the back of her drawer. She had bigger things to survive than old paper, or so she thought. She first noticed the man in the gray jacket on a Tuesday. 2 cars back on the subway platform, getting off at her stop without once checking a map or a phone. She told herself it was nothing. She noticed him again on Thursday, parked outside the hospital. The same jacket. The same unnatural stillness of someone who wasn't actually waiting for anyone on Friday. She didn't wait to find out why. She cut through the market instead of the main road, doubled back through a noodle shop's kitchen over the owner's protests, and didn't stop walking until she'd circled 3 full blocks and confirmed, hard hammering, that no one was behind her anymore. She told herself it was nothing. She did not tell Min-jun. Not yet. She had no idea that opening that folder would turn out to be the most dangerous thing she'd ever do. More dangerous, even, than the fire.it was an ordinary Tuesday when ordinary ended. Out of paper to write her mother's medication schedule, Amara finally emptied the folder onto her kitchen table and stopped breathing. A partnership contract, dated 1985, water-stained but legible. 2 signatures.
Kang CHUL.
And beside it, in careful looping English, Amara Eze. Her father's name on a 30% ownership stake in a company called Kang Maritime Trading, the company that would one day become Kang Group. Beneath it, a second document. A transfer of those same shares to 0%, dated months later, her father's signature shaky and wrong compared to the steady hand on every other page in the folder. Her father had died believing he'd failed in business. He had never told her he'd once owned a third of an empire, or that someone had taken it from him with a forged signature and made him disappear from the story entirely. There was more in the folder than contracts. Tucked into the back flap, she found a handful of old photographs and a letter in her father's handwriting, dated only months before she was born. He wrote about late nights at the harbor warehouses with a friend he called only Sang, about learning enough Korean to argue prices at the fish market, about a partnership he was certain would, in his own words, put both our names on something that outlasts us. The last line, written in a hand far steadier than the forced signature on the transfer document, simply read, "Tell her, if I never get the chance myself, that I built something real before I came home with nothing." He read it 4 times before she could breathe normally again. Whatever else the folder cost her, it had also given her something she'd spent 3 years grieving without. Proof that her father hadn't simply failed. He had been robbed of the one thing he'd actually built. And now, by accident, by fire, by her own stubborn instinct not to leave a folder behind in a burning room, she was the only person left who could prove it. She brought the letter to the hospital the next evening and read it aloud to her mother, slowly, in the English her father had written it in. Ngozi listened with her eyes closed, and when Amara finished, she didn't speak for a long moment. "He told me once, in our first year here, that he'd built something he was proud of and lost it to a man who smiled while he did it," her mother finally said. "I always thought he meant a fishing boat." She reached for her daughter's hand, her grip still weak but certain. "Finish what he started, Amara. Don't you dare bury it the way he had to." She barely slept that night, staring at the documents, terrified of what they meant and more terrified of who might still be looking for them. She found out how right she was to be afraid 3 nights later, when a soft knock came at her apartment door past 11. She opened it to find Choi standing in the hallway, the same gray jacket from the subway, smiling too widely. "Just checking on you, Ms. Eze," he said. "The company likes to look after its valued employees." His eyes flicked, just once, to the bag she'd instinctively pulled behind her leg. Then he was gone. She locked the door, sat on the floor with her back against it, and finally understood. Someone already knew exactly what she had. She told Min-jun the next day, hands shaking as she laid the documents on his desk. She expected disbelief. Instead his face went pale. He'd seen that signature before, on a faded photo from his grandfather's office. An old man and a younger African businessman, arms around each other's shoulders, a caption no one in the family had ever explained. There was a name penciled on the back of that same photo, one Min-jun had never thought to ask about until tonight. Oh Byung-chul, his grandfather's assistant. If the man was still alive, he might be the only living person who could confirm everything the documents only implied. Finding him before anyone else did mattered more, Min-jun realized, than bringing the folder to his father right away. If Dae-young's people reached an elderly witness first, paper alone wouldn't save anyone. The address took half a day to track down. A modest apartment building in a quiet district, the kind of place a retired company man settled into and was forgotten. Min-jun and Amara arrived just after dusk to find the building's front door already standing open, and a familiar gray jacket disappearing around the stairwell ahead of them. They took the stairs 2 at a time. By the 3rd floor they could hear it. Drawers being pulled out, furniture scraped across the floor, an old man's voice raised in confusion rather than fear. Min-jun reached the apartment first and found Choi rifling through a filing cabinet while Mr. Oh stood frozen by the window, clutching a framed photograph to his chest. Amara didn't hesitate. She pulled the building's hallway fire alarm, the way she'd once put out a different fire with nothing but instinct and a steady hand, and the corridor exploded into noise and flashing light. Choi swore and turned toward the sound instead of the door, just long enough for Min-jun to get an arm around the old man's shoulders and steer him out through the stairwell exit while Amara blocked the doorway behind them. Choi reached the building's entrance just as their car pulled away from the curb, fast enough to slap a hand flat against the trunk before losing his grip entirely. For half a block his shape filled the rearview mirror, sprinting, gaining nothing, falling further behind with every red light Min-jun risked running through, until he finally gave up the chase at an intersection he had no way to beat. They didn't take Mr. O home again that night. They took him somewhere safer, a quiet property under a name that wasn't Kang, with a Dr. Min-jun trusted and a door that locked from the inside. Getting Mr. O to safety was only half the problem. The next morning, Min-jun drove the original folder to his family's lawyer himself rather than trust a courier, and noticed 3 traffic lights from the office. The same dark sedan from the warehouse incident sitting 2 cars back. He didn't speed up. He didn't panic. He took the longer route past the harbor, doubled through an underground car park with 2 exits, and didn't stop checking his mirrors until the documents were locked inside a bank vault under a name that wasn't his own. By the time he checked again, the sedan was gone. But he knew now, with total certainty, that someone had been watching every move he made since the night of the fire. Losing the old man rattled Dae-young more than he let anyone see. He summoned Choi to the underground garage a second time, his composure noticeably thinner than before. "Push the engagement announcement to next week," he said. "Public, televised, unmovable. Once it's done, no scandal touches this company without sinking the bride's family too. And her father won't allow that." It was a good plan, built entirely on the assumption that everyone in this story was still playing by the old rules. Only then, with both the documents and a living witness finally out of reach, did Min-jun bring everything to his father. It should have ended there. Instead, Dae-young got there first. At a family dinner meant to finalize wedding plans, he stood and slammed a folder of his own onto the table. Handwriting samples he claimed proved Amara had spent weeks practicing her father's signature. It was a lie built well enough to work. A cleaner, he reminded the table. With motive, with opportunity, and conveniently the only witness to a fire she crawled out of herself. The room turned, almost as one, to look at her differently than it had an hour earlier. The chairman, mid-merger and terrified of scandal, called for security before Min-jun could finish a sentence in her defense. 2 guards reached for her arms. Min-jun stepped bodily between them and his father's order, and for 3 long seconds nobody in that room moved at all. That it didn't matter. By morning, the chairman had quietly overruled his son. Security walked Amara out of the building she'd nearly died defending. Her badge deactivated before she'd even reached the lobby. That night, while she sat at her mother's bedside, 2 of Choi's men let themselves into her apartment. They were thorough, emptying drawers, prying up a loose floorboard, slicing open the lining of her one good coat, even tipping over the small framed photo of her father she kept by the bed, as though daring her to notice what else they were capable of touching. They never found anything, because the real documents had been gone for days. Amara came home just after midnight to find her door unlocked and her belongings scattered across the floor. She didn't go inside. She stood frozen on the landing, pulse hammering, until a neighbor's dog started barking somewhere below, and only then did she hear it. The soft click of her own bedroom window being eased shut from the inside. She ran down 4 flights of stairs and out into the rain, dialing Min-jun's number before she'd even reached the street. His car already turning the corner by the time she got there. Outside the hospital the next evening, Choi stopped her on the sidewalk himself, calm and almost friendly, sliding an envelope of cash toward her with one hand. "Sign the retraction. Take the flight home tomorrow. No one needs to make this difficult." When she didn't reach for it, his other hand closed around her wrist instead. His grip pleasant and absolutely immovable. "I said," he repeated, quieter now, "don't make this difficult. Tell your boss," Amara said, voice steadier than she felt, "that my father didn't run from this fight, and I'm not running either." Choi let go a half-second before Min-jun's car reached them, not from fear, but the unhurried calm of a man who simply preferred not to be seen. He was 3 storefronts away before Min-jun even finished asking if she was hurt. What none of them knew yet was that the night that mattered most hadn't happened. Not even close. The engagement dinner went ahead as scheduled. The chairman insisted the optics couldn't survive another delay. Cameras lined the ballroom. Yoon Seo-yeon stood beside Min-jun in white, dignified and unreadable. Before the ceremonial cup was poured, Min-jun set it down untouched. "I won't marry a lie my family has buried for 40 years, he said, loud enough for every camera to catch it. He laid the original 1985 contract on the table beside a forensic handwriting report, proving the transfer signature was forged. Then he stepped aside, and a frail man in his late 70s walked through the ballroom doors on Amara's arm, safe, steady, and very much alive. Mr. Eze was forced to sign after an accident that was no accident, Oh Byung-chul said, his voice trembling but clear enough to silence 300 conversations at once. Director Dae-young's father arranged it himself. I have lived 40 years ashamed that I said nothing, and I nearly lost the chance to say it tonight. His eyes found Choi near the side exit, and the room understood exactly what he meant. Seo-yeon was the first to move, stepping deliberately away from Min-jun's side. I suspected the merger numbers were inflated months ago, she said evenly. I won't be married off to cover for a man's fraud. She turned briefly to Amara. I'm sorry it took this long for someone to listen to you. Dae-young didn't wait to be accused outright. He swept the documents off the table in one motion and shoved past a server toward the kitchen doors, Choi already moving to cover his exit. Min-jun went after them both, Amara right behind him, through a kitchen full of startled staff and out into the loading bay beyond. The same loading bay, one floor below the same parking structure where two masked men had vanished into the dark months earlier. This time there was nowhere left to vanish to. Security had already sealed the gate. Choi stopped the moment he saw it, raised both hands, and let himself be taken without a word. A professional, even in defeat. Dae-young kept going until he hit the chain-link fence at the far end. For one wild second he reached for a lit candle still burning on a nearby catering cart, as if he might burn the evidence a second time, the way his father once tried to burn the truth out of memory itself. But a security guard's hand closed over his wrist before the flame ever touched the page. He simply stood there afterward, breathing hard, the documents crumpled uselessly in his fist, while the chairman's car pulled up and his uncle stepped out to watch in silence. Exactly how it ended. The chairman stood in the ballroom doorway for a long moment in front of 300 witnesses and the family name he'd spent his life protecting. Then he did the only thing left that could protect it. He walked back to Amara and bowed, low and unhurried, an apology with no script. It was the first time in either of their lives that a Kang had bowed first. Dae-young was indicted within the month. The embezzlement charges alone enough to end any hope of a board seat ever again. Choi, it turned out, had kept meticulous records of every job he'd ever been paid for. Insurance, he later told investigators, for exactly this kind of night. The whole truth came out anyway, just not the way anyone at that dinner had expected. 6 weeks later, Amara's mother sat in the front row of a small ceremony in the rebuilt archive room. Now a modest memorial corner, two portraits side by side. Kang Sang-chul and Amara Eze, co-founders. The records finally corrected. There was no fanfare, no press release this time, just a brass plaque, a handful of fresh flowers, and a chairman who insisted on reading the inscription aloud himself before anyone else could. Amara's restored 30% stake, held now in her name, had made her, almost overnight, one of the company's largest individual shareholders. Mr. O stood near the front too, finally able to go home in peace, his old fear traded for something closer to relief. The chairman's first public act after the scandal was a foundation bearing both founders' names, funding logistics scholarships for students traveling between Lagos and Seoul the way Amara once had, except this time, no one would have to clean floors at midnight to afford the dream. She didn't care about the number on the page nearly as much as the man standing beside her in front of the same board that had once walked her out the door. She'd already started reviewing the company's outstanding freight contracts from her mother's hospital room, just to keep her mind busy, and found 2 more errors no one else had caught. I had the whole speech planned, Min-jun admitted quietly, just for her. Something about contracts and shares and finally setting the record straight. And now, he took her hand instead, in front of everyone who had once doubted her. Now I just want to ask if you'll let a Kang sign one more contract with an ease. This one, I'll let you write the terms. A date for the wedding hadn't been set yet. Neither of them was in any hurry this time, now that no one could force the timeline but the two of them. Ngozi Eze, healthier now than she'd been in 3 years, laughed loud enough that the chairman himself glanced over with something almost like a smile. Somewhere across the room, Seo-yun raised a glass in their direction before slipping out early, already halfway back to the life she'd chosen for herself. And near the doorway, Oh Byung-chul stood quietly with his framed photograph, finally able to look at it without flinching. Some inheritances are written in gold. Hers was written in forgiveness, and it took a fire, a forgery, and one stubborn love story to finally read it right. If the story had you hooked, tell us in the comments. Would you have signed the retraction, or fought like Amara did?